Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review. 7 stories from the American Revolution, where we'll be talking about the last 7 founders of the day. Of course, they were both published on the website, Founder of the Day in article form, and published right here on YouTube in video form. Must apologize for my hair. I took a shower not too long ago. I popped a hat on to dry it off, and it looks ridiculous. Please forgive me. Let's get right to it. We are going to pop up with our first founder, Anti-Federalist. If you've been here at all, you've known that the last, what was it, 13? Yes, 13 Fridays, we've published an Anti-Federalist paper, specifically about the federal farmer. We've actually been publishing them for about a year now. So, federal farmer, we've gone through them. I'm not going to get too into it. This week's video was a wrap-up of the 13 articles. Federal farmer really focused mostly on consolidation. He was very afraid of the states eventually being proven valueless and being absorbed, or essentially becoming second tier to the federal government or the national government, as opposed to, equal footing, which, may or may not be valid. The federal farmer, he also focused a lot on the House of Representatives, how it's not really as representative as it should be. He had that interesting one where he discussed nobility and how nobility is convenient when you have a lower house to represent the people and an upper house to represent the nobility, which is how the English government is modeled and was kind of what the United States modeled their government off of also. My hair's really bothering me today. I'm not going to get too into the federal farmer. I think that's enough. We've discussed so much of it. I don't want to get too deep for you guys. You know what's going on there. Our next founder is John Rutledge, but since his brother Edward Rutledge was also this week, I had this week, the top 100 founders. It was a lot of fun. I'm gonna just list off the top 100 from 100 to 1. Ready? Go. Gunning Bedford, Elizabeth Freeman, Daniel Shays, Robert Treat Paine, Philip Livingston, Edmund Pendleton, Edward Rutledge, Ethan Allen, Joseph Reed, Ebenezer Hazard, Stephen Hopkins, Mercy Otis Warren, Benjamin Harrison, Benjamin Talmadge, Daniel Boone, James McHenry, Phyllis Wheatley, Bushrod Washington, William Blount, William Moultrie, Essex Hopkins, William Livingston, Robert Howe, Nicholas Gilman, Casimir Pulaski, Lord Sterling, Caesar Rodney, Chaim Solomon, Anthony Wayne, John Paul Jones, George Rogers Clark, Benjamin Banneker, Jonathan Trumbull, Alexander McDougall, Artemus Ward, George Mason, Francis Marion, Daniel Morgan, Charles Lee, William Samuel Johnson, John Langdon, John Sullivan, Richard Montgomery, Christopher Gadsden, George Clymer, Paul Revere, Horatio Gates, Robert Hanson Harrison, Thomas Paine, Philip Schuyler. Halfway there. Tench Coates, Lambert Wicks, Henry Lawrence, George Reed, John Hancock, Nathaniel Gorham, Charles Thompson, Henry Dearborn, Francis Dana, Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, James Otis, Joseph Warren, David Brearley, Albert Gallatin, James Wilson, Oliver Wolcott, Thomas Mifflin, George Wythe, Richard Henry Lee, Benjamin Rush, Baron von Steuben, Marquis de Lafayette, Charles Coachworth Pinckney, Roger Sherman, Silas Dean, Benedict Arnold, Timothy Pickering, Aaron Burr, George Clinton, Oliver Ellsworth, Robert R. Livingston, Henry Knox, Gouverneur Morris, John Rutledge, John Marshall, Rufus King, Edmund Randolph, James Monroe, Elbridge Gerry, Nathaniel Greene, Robert Morris, John Jay, John Dickinson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Whammy. I got through them all pretty quick compared to the almost 3 hours I spent justifying that list last week. All right, but we're gonna get rid of that. Let's go back here. Let's talk about John Rutledge. So John Rutledge is just unbearably overlooked when it comes to the American Revolution. His name on that list I just named, let's go back and take a look. John Rutledge was number 16. So according to my calculations, John Rutledge is one of the top 20 most important American founders. Rutledge starts out early in his life, 26 or so years old. He goes to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City 10 years before the Revolutionary War actually breaks out. He's a minor but important member of that Congress. He also meets a lot of people that he will go on to be super friendly with, and very important people. Philip Livingston, who was also on that list. Christopher Gadsden, who's also on that list, although they were both from South Carolina, so they went together. And while other names are eluding me off the top of my head, he made friends with a lot of future revolutionaries. He ends up later on being elected to the First Continental Congress, where he signs the Articles of Association, starting the boycott. He then goes to the Second Continental Congress, where he leaves just before voting for independence, because he was recalled as president of Pennsylvania, which was kind of an interim position, because after independence, he goes on to become governor of Virginia, the first post-governor of Virginia. Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for coming. Rutledge goes on to be, like I said, the first, not Virginia, South Carolina. He goes on to be the first post-independence governor of South Carolina. He's usually credited as, I think the 31st governor of South Carolina. Even though he acted as president for that little bit there, he's essentially president of the shadow government in the build-up to revolution. Fortunately, he leaves too early to sign the Declaration of Independence. His brother Edward does sign it. We will get back to him in a minute. John then goes and serves as governor of South Carolina for almost the entirety of the war. I think it's 2 3-year terms with 1 year in there, or serves 3 1-year terms, takes a year off, serves 3 more 1-year terms, oversees the government during the Revolutionary time, during the invasion of Charleston. He plays a big role in the first repelling of the British when they attacked Charleston. Then he goes to practice law. He actually goes back to Continental Congress for a little bit. He becomes a justice in the state's Court of Chancery, which is kind of like a Supreme Court, during the 1780s. And then he's elected to the appointed to the Constitutional Convention. And he sits for almost every session. I believe he was one of the few guys who actually sat at every session, but don't quote me on that. But plays an important role in debates on the executive, appropriation bills, property ownership requirements, things of that nature. So maybe not the biggest player in the creation of the Constitution, but an important one nonetheless, and a signer of the Constitution. Again, this is a guy who went to the Stamp Act Congress 23 years beforehand. When the new government is put into play, George Washington nominates a bunch of justices for the United States Supreme Court, and John Rutledge is one of those inaugural justices. He only serves for about 1.5 years before he resigns, but then after John Jay decides he doesn't want to play anymore, John Rutledge is appointed as acting Chief Justice of the United States of America. The second person, as you can see next to me, the second Chief Justice of the United States. He is then recommended by Washington to the Senate to become full-time Chief Justice instead of acting. Unfortunately, it's about this time that the Jay Treaty shows up, and John Rutledge does not like it. And not only does he publicly give speeches about how terrible the Jay Treaty is, he actively and openly criticizes George Washington. And while this was a time where criticizing Washington was starting to be in vogue a little bit for the first time for decades for Mr. Washington, President Washington, General Washington, when you're nominated to be chosen, the Senate was controlled by Federalists. And if you're talking about their president, when they're the ones who are supposed to decide if you're going to be Chief Justice, that's not a great idea. They are not going to like that. So that's what John Rutledge did. He realizes the error of his ways, where he's not going to be chosen as the full-time Chief Justice, though he is credited as the second Chief Justice. John Rutledge then attempts suicide. He jumps off of a bridge, off a dock in South Carolina. He is saved by a few passing slaves, and though he is okay, it's the end of his political career. And although I've said it very quickly, it was a long and fruitful political career, and one of the most important and underrated to the creation of the United States. So we're going to bounce over here. Whoops. We are going to jump up a bit to John's younger brother, Edward Rutledge. Edward Rutledge, while his older brother, is going to the Stamp Act Congress in the 1760s, Edward Rutledge goes over to Europe and gets his education, as his brother did. Edward comes back and starts a law degree, and he does really well. Actually, he starts a partnership with Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, who would, in a few decades, be the Federalist nominee for President of the United States on 2 separate occasions. So they come up together. He is then, about a year later, sent to the Continental Congress. Oh, he also became famous, at least in South Carolina, throughout the South, if not in all the colonies, for securing the release of a prisoner who had been put in prison for criticizing the crown. And he had proven in a royal court at the time that you could not hold someone if they didn't say anything that was wrong. Because of this, when his brother John comes back to become president of the shadow government that was running South Carolina at the time, Edward is sent as his replacement to the Second Continental Congress just in time to vote for independence and then sign the Declaration of Independence. And because of his situation, despite being only in his late 20s, he's really the leader of the South Carolina delegation. I like to stop here and note, for any time the Declaration of Independence is portrayed in media, the play 1776, the John Adams miniseries, Edward Rutledge is always the bad guy. He's always the one that the founders are essentially accusing of. He's the one giving them a hard time. No, I need this if we're going to vote for independence. I need that if we're going to vote for independence. The truth of the matter is we don't actually see any historical fact saying that he was giving Ben Franklin and John Adams any trouble. He just happens to be the first guy that was picked when they were... Oh, got a bug flying through. Oh, there it goes. Well, that's certainly distracting. We got the stink bugs time of year. They're getting in. I don't know how they're getting in, but they're getting in. Anyway, poor Edward Rutledge. He was a young man. The one famous Broadway play, the 1776 play, made him the guy who wanted to give him trouble. And from there, everyone piggybacked and leapfrogged off that. And poor Edward Rutledge is now getting the animal treatment. He seems to have been a valid patriot. As I said, he voted for independence. He signed the Declaration of Independence. His most interesting story is when the Howe brothers running the federal government, someone left. They did not like that the bug came after me. Oh, still there. The Howe brothers, Admiral Howe, General Howe, who were running the show when it came to the British, asked for a peace conference. They want to talk to the Patriots, see if they can smooth things out, come back under the crown. We'll be super cool, go back to the way things were. The Americans' Continental Congress sent 3 delegates: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Edward Rutledge. Now, the famous part of this story is actually Ben Franklin and John Adams, who are sharing a bedroom, and one of them's hot, one of them's cold. I don't remember which is which, but one of them's hot while they're sleeping, gets up, opens the window, goes back to sleep. The other one's cold, gets up, closes the window, and this goes on all night. Neither of them get much sleep. Johnny Adams and Benjamin Franklin, 2 of the biggest founders. Edward Rutledge was also on that trip. I'm not sure if he was even in the room or not. He was only 27 and would have been keeping quiet because, not only was John Adams a little bit older than he was, but Ben Franklin was super famous at this point, and he probably didn't want to make waves with the Poor Richard. That being said, the Staten Island Peace Conference, as it was known, came to absolutely nothing. The British were not permitted to yield independence to the Patriots, and the Patriots were not permitted to give anything, were not permitted to give up independence. So you have, the American delegation at Staten Island can't do anything. The British delegation at Staten Island can't do anything. And what do you know? No peace agreement. Days later, the British invade New York City. Rutledge would go on to be low-key, if not the most important founder, a pretty important founder to South Carolina. He did serve in the militia for on several occasions, and he was actually at Charleston when it was seized in 1780, and he spends over a year as a prisoner of war of the British, which, as a guy who signed that treasonous Declaration of Independence, could have been real trouble for him. He stays in local government mostly in the South Carolina House of Representatives for the next 20 years, until eventually he is elected governor. And he's governor for about almost 2 years. Unfortunately, he does pass away while he's in office. Still fairly young, about 50 years old. But that's the end of the youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence, Edward Rutledge. So let's see who's next. We got 3 more guys left. It's going to be a little bit of a short week because we had that big Founders Countdown list. Doesn't really count. Richard Henry Lee. Take a quick sip of water here because Richard Henry Lee is a lot of fun. Now, most of you will know who Richard Henry Lee is. He's pretty famous. But what we might not know about Richard Henry Lee was his time as a tax collector. Yeah. So Lee goes over to England, gets his education, comes back from England. Now he's a lawyer. He becomes a justice of the peace pretty quick, and he takes a seat in the House of Burgesses, Virginia's colonial assembly. By the time he's 34, he's doing pretty well for himself. And then suddenly, Britain passes the Stamp Act. Now, we know Richard Henry Lee is not tax kind of guy, but in his early 30s, when this Stamp Act got passed, well, there were some job openings for stampers. And Richard Henry Lee applied for and got the job of tax collector. Yeah, often overlooked is Richard Henry Lee was very excited to get that stamp, start a stamping for some money. What he didn't expect was to go into the House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature, and almost immediately be censured by all his friends in that body because they didn't like that Stamp Act one bit. Now, Richard quickly realizes his mistake and resigns from that position. He then dives into why everyone's so unhappy about the Stamp Act and really learns the reasons for it. And from there, because he was so embarrassed, it seems, takes the lead in fighting the Stamp Act. Now, he actually is the author of what's called the Westmoreland Resolves, as you see next to me. At the time, in the late 1760s, early 1770s, before the war breaks out, many communities were producing resolves. The local government would come together, they'd talk about why they hated these taxes so much, and they would resolve to declare their rights and state their grievances. And while the Westmoreland Resolves don't really stand out compared to the other ones, except for the fact that Richard Henry Lee is the one who authored them and he would go on to be very famous, they are just a simple set of resolves from that county. Again, he authors them, he signs them, a bunch of the leaders from that area sign them, they send them off to Great Britain, nothing much comes of it, and then time goes on and he becomes the Richard Henry Lee whose story you are familiar with. Now, as I said, many people don't realize where his story starts, but after this, he goes on to go to the Continental Congress. He's the one who stands on the floor of Congress, and as another resolution, he resolves that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and all allegiance is absolved, blah, 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 RHL. And he goes on to be a president of the Continental Congress. He doesn't love the Constitution, but he does support the federal government once it comes around. Actually, he does have some good anti-federalist quotes. Maybe during our anti-federalist Fridays, we'll get to Richard Henry Lee. Although tomorrow we start with Cato. Okay. Who's next? Samuel Allen Otis. So, fans of the American Revolution, you know about the Otis family. You know James Otis. He was one of the first guys yelling at Britain. Basically, by the time the 1750s turned, during the French and Indian War, he starts getting angry at writs of assistance, which was essentially warrants the government would grant to citizens and deputized citizens, but instead of saying, here's a warrant, go search that person, they'd say, here's a warrant, you can search anyone you want, and you can sell it. If you want to get some money and give whoever the right to search anyone, anywhere, at any time. If that sounds crazy, that's how James Otis felt. Now, James was about 10 years older than Samuel Allen, but that's the household Samuel Allen Otis grew up in. Oh, by the way, his older sister was Mercy Otis Warren, who was one of the first really popular female authors in the United States and one of the first women to publish under her real name eventually. She wrote a bunch of famous plays. She goes on to be an anti-federalist. She was friends with John and Abigail Adams, but she writes a history of the Revolution, and they are not happy about that. And that brings us to Samuel Allen, the least famous one in the family, despite doing some really impressive things. When the Revolutionary War breaks out, Samuel Allen Otis is a merchant. He has a bunch of ships. He outfits them as privateers, which makes him wealthy, but does help fight the war. Additionally, he becomes a deputy clothier general. It's hard for me to get that word out. Clothier general. And he secured upwards of 10,000 uniforms for the Patriots to wear while they were fighting, and other forms of clothing, because clothing was tough to get a hold of at the time. During this time, he's in the Massachusetts state government. He makes his way up. Eventually, he is sent to the Continental Congress, where he sees certain problems with the Constitution. He goes back. As I said, his sister Mercy becomes an anti-federalist, but Samuel Allen Otis, having served in the Continental Congress, despite being at the end of the Continental Congress, the Constitution had already been published at that point, he sees the problems in the Continental Congress, and he supports the Constitution. He then finds himself in a pretty interesting situation because he is nominated by John Adams. Yeah, John Adams is back from England and he's vice president now. And as vice president, he's overseeing the Senate, and John Adams nominates and then kind of finagles Samuel Allen Otis to become the first secretary of the Senate. Secretary of the Senate is a hired position. He was the secretary. He was supposed to do the work that these people voted should be done. He would have to oversee the correspondence, this and that. Now, it's interesting because Charles Thompson had been Secretary of the Continental Congress the whole time. A super underrated character in the American Revolution, Charles Thompson, doing the hard work of the Continental Congress. Thompson should have been the natural pick for this position, but Thompson makes the mistake of trying to become Secretary of State. And yes, Thomas Jefferson was George Washington's first choice for Secretary of State, but no one knew if there'd be two Secretaries of State then, because maybe we'd have a Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and a Secretary of State for Internal Affairs. And Charles Thompson thought that was the case, and he tried to get Secretary for Internal Affairs. And that didn't happen because George Washington was like, no, we're just doing one. So Thompson scrambles and runs back and tries to become Secretary of the Senate and essentially take up his old position, which he was immensely qualified for. But by this point, some people already wanted Otis. So what a few people who were against Thompson did, they said, hey, we have a special job for you. You have to go down to Mount Vernon and escort George Washington to New York City to take his oath of office. Now, Washington didn't know about this, but he was polite and he rode up with Thompson because they had known each other a while now, and Thompson seemed to be a nice guy. Unfortunately, by the time they get back, John Adams had finagled things to get Samuel Allen Otis chosen as the first Secretary of the Senate in a very close election. Now, of all the jobs he had to do, the most famous one and the most important one probably is that Samuel Allen Otis, was the man who got to hold the Bible for George Washington to put his hand on when he was sworn into office as the inaugural president of the United States. Otis would then go on to spend the rest of his life as Secretary of the Senate, 25 years and 4 presidencies. And once he had the job, he was not kicked out by anyone. None of the presidents tried to get rid of him. No one in the Senate tried to get rid of him. He just was good at the job, so he kept doing it, much like Charles Thompson had done before him, unfortunately for Thompson. Interestingly, also, I've mentioned about how Otis had a famous older brother and a famous older sister. His son, Harrison Gray Otis, becomes a famous politician in the first 25 years of the 19th century. He becomes not only a representative while his father is Secretary of the Senate, but eventually becomes a senator himself. Unfortunately for Harrison Gray Otis, he's one of the main players at the Hartford Convention, which was a disaster. But that's Samuel Allen Otis, despite all the fun stuff I just told you, is the least famous member of his family. So we'll give him some credit today, and we'll move on to Thompson's War. So Samuel Thompson, no known image, is really important to the Revolutionary War in Maine. He lived in Falmouth, Maine, Falmouth, Massachusetts, which we now know as Portland, Maine. While he was there, it was a very small place. Did the slaves get commended or praised for saving Rutledge? Ooh, interesting question, Gallery. You're a little bit behind. I don't know. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of documentation, at least that I was able to find, about the slaves themselves. They seem to have gotten neither praised nor commended because they were cast off and said it was some slaves. It's kind of how the historical record goes. Unfortunately, of course. Great question, though. As for Thompson, by 1775, he was a tavern owner and a merchant. A general store operator and a tavern owner and an inn owner in what is now Portland, Maine. While he's there, he ends up being really respected by his neighbors, and he's sent to the Massachusetts colonial legislature. Of course, Maine was a part of Massachusetts until 1820. So he technically is living in Maine, Massachusetts. He goes to the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly on several occasions. During this time, the First Continental Congress meets. They institute the boycott on British goods. They say, hey, Thompson, can you take care of this? Thompson goes, absolutely, I'll take care of it. He goes back to Falmouth, and he's in charge of making sure no British goods are unloaded in that little port town. Of course, enforcing the boycott is no easy task, and a ship does come in, and it says, hey, we want to unload these goods here, and Thompson says, no way, get out of here. And the ship's captain says, listen, I need repairs. We hit some storms. I need some repairs. Can I at least have a few weeks to repair it? Thompson says, yeah, absolutely. We're cool here. You can take your time. Just don't unload any of your cargo. Okay, says the captain. And things go back to normal until a ship arrives. A Navy ship. And the name is Mawet. I can't remember the guy's first name. There was a gentleman, British Navy ship arrives, and the captain's last name is Mawet, and he gets off and he says, hey, we're going to unload this stuff now. And Thompson goes, sure. The next day, a bunch of patriots, Thompson, by the way, is an officer in the local militia. He has his men put spruce twigs in their hats because they didn't have uniforms out there. They had spruce twigs to put in their hats. That's why we get this logo, and the story I'm about to tell you is why the Massachusetts Navy had this flag. Yes, each state had its own navy. Most of the states had their own navy, not all of them, but at the time they didn't know about a Continental Congress or a Continental Navy. They just needed some ship boats to be sailing around shooting Brits. So, they put the spruce twigs in their hats. A bunch of gentlemen go out on lifeboats, or not lifeboats, but rowboats, and surround the ship and hold it up and say, you're not unloading anything. At the same time, a bunch of patriots go find Mawet, who's in church in town, and they take him to Thompson. And Thompson says, so you're going to leave now? And he says, yeah, fine. And he gets on a boat and leaves. That little incident is what's called Thompson's War. It was about a day and a half, and no one was killed. But just so you know, Thompson, Mawet would later come back and be the one responsible for burning Falmouth. He would get his revenge. As for Thompson, his story is fun. He gets promoted to a brigadier general in the state militia, though he stays around Maine, and there's not a whole ton of action that he sees, but he remains an important member of his community. He's in early discussions about Maine ceding and becoming its own state. He leads many of those conventions. He then is sent back to the now state assembly, the Massachusetts House. Eventually, he is sent to the Constitutional Ratification Convention to discuss whether or not they accept the Constitution. And Thompson was a big old anti-federalist. He also becomes an early anti-slavery advocate. And I have very interesting quotes for both of these. First of all, he talks about he rises at Massachusetts Ratification Convention, and he says, quote, it is strange that a system, which its planners say is so plain, should want so much explanation. I just love that quote. If it's so obvious that we should accept this, how come you got to do so much explaining? He also has an interesting quote where he basically insults George Washington, which you don't get a lot of at this point in the late 1780s. You know, it would come back a little bit while he was president in his second term, but at this point you don't get a lot of that. But he's again speaking on the floor of the Massachusetts Ratification Convention. Samuel Thompson criticizes George Washington for continuing the practice of slavery and saying, quote, his character has sunk 50%. About the retired general? Came out of retirement just to write this great new government? How dare Samuel Thompson? He spends the rest of his life in the Massachusetts Senate, Massachusetts House of Representatives, and then sadly is finally elected to the Massachusetts State Senate and passes away just a month later. Doesn't even get to take his seat. After a lifetime of hard work where no one even bothered to draw his picture. Imagine that. Well, that's Samuel Thompson and his little tiny war up in Maine. Right after Lexington and Concord, I forgot to mention that, is that Mawet showed up to unload that cargo a week and 2.5 weeks after Lexington and Concord. I think it was May 9th. So that's pretty much it for the week, Founder fans. Thank you so much for coming and watching, having a good old time. We're doing a little quick. It's about half an hour. These were an hour, but I've noticed you guys, you watch the other videos. We do have trivia tomorrow. I'm going to announce a few changes to trivia tomorrow, so make sure you're there for that. Like I said, I've been putting out my schedules every Monday, so you know what's coming up. If you have any questions, I'm always here for it. Find me in the email below. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever's convenient. You find me there. I am all done, and I will be back with another Founder for you tomorrow and round bottom.